What do you think of when you imagine the greatest river in the world? The Amazon? The Nile? The Congo? The Mississippi? What about the River Thames, the lifeblood of London? It flows with memories of warships that went out to sea and came back victorious, of explorers who set out to discover the globe as messengers of the greatness of Britain. Just imagine who and what floated down this river, once the heart of the empire on which the sun never set. But this also has been one of the dark places of the earth. 2,000 years before the height of the British Empire, the Thames was on the receiving end of conquest. When the Romans first sailed up the river into that wilderness at the end of the world, the tribal, primitive civilization they saw there must have seemed barbaric compared to the glory of Rome. But these Romans were men enough to face the darkness, to feel the savagery, the utter savagery, closed all around them. All that mysterious life of the wilderness that stirs in the forest, in the hearts of wild men. There's no initiation either into such mysteries. He has to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is also detestable. And it has a fascination too that goes to work upon him. The fascination of the abomination. Imagine the growing regrets, the longing to escape, the powerless disgust, the surrender, the hate. They were conquerors. They grabbed what they could for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind, as is proper for those who tackle a darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. But the story of conquest is a story as old as time. From ancient empires to European colonialism to American interventionism, it never fundamentally changes. For all the love and collaboration human beings are capable of, there is a brutally indifferent darkness at the heart of our nature, which rears its ugly head from time to time. Take away all the luxuries of civilization, and we're animals, driven to survive by monstrous and carnal passions. Denying this is ignorant and naive, but fully embracing it leads down a slippery slope. The challenge for the complete individual is to come to understand the darkness without succumbing to it. A task much easier said than done. This is the ultimate quest of Marlow, the protagonist of Joseph Conrad's 1899 novella, Heart of Darkness. Marlow is tasked with traveling deep into the wilderness to recover a man who's gone rogue. Along the way, it becomes clear that he will have to complete a journey that is not only physical but psychological. As well as confronting real-world horrors, he must face the shadow of his own soul, to descend deep into his own heart of darkness and understand the fears and temptations that drive him, and what he might be capable of when no one is watching. He will have to learn to dance with the devil without being seduced by him. Joseph Conrad was a Polish-born sailor who didn't become fluent in English until his 20s, but that didn't stop him from writing one of the most important works in the history of the language. His seafaring adventures profoundly inspired his literary career, and in 1890, at the height of European colonialism during the scramble for Africa, Conrad undertook a journey that would become the foundation of his magnum opus. Hired by a Belgian trading company, he captained a steamboat on the Congo River. At the time, the Belgian Congo, or the Congo Free State as it was officially named, was owned by one man, King Leopold II. He framed his project as a philanthropic mission to civilize the population and develop the area for the benefit of the locals. The real result was the brutal exploitation of the people and the funneling of all profits into the coffers of the king. As much as half of the local population was wiped out in provinces where resources like rubber and ivory were being extracted. Conrad's job was to replace a captain who had died, but his crew faced constant setbacks and he fell gravely ill himself, which only amplified the horrific things he saw on his journey up the river. In the novella, Marlow was hired to undertake a similar journey to reach Kurtz's inner station deep in the jungle. Once there, Marlow will have to verify reports that Kurtz has gone insane, operating independently of the company and creating a cult-like following amongst the natives. Finally, Marlow will have to restore Kurtz to the company or remove him and bring him back to civilization. From the moment Marlow arrives at the company's first station at the mouth of the river, he is disturbed by the unforgiving environment of the jungle and the brutality of the slavery he witnesses. Black shapes crouched, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced within the dim light, in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. They sickened, became inefficient, and were then allowed to crawl away and rest. All about, others were scattered in every pose of contorted collapse, as in some picture of a massacre or a pestilence. Meanwhile, the Europeans at the station, untouched by the suffering around them, stroll about aimlessly in the sunshine. The silent wilderness surrounding this cleared speck on the earth struck me as something great and invincible, like evil or truth, waiting patiently for the passing away of this fantastic invasion. As Marlow works to get his broken down steamboat back up and running, he begins to hear rumors about Kurtz. "In the interior, you will no doubt meet Mr. Kurtz," says the company's chief accountant. "He is a very remarkable person. Sends in as much ivory as all the others put together." Marlow is skeptical, but gradually becomes more intrigued by Kurtz's enigmatic reputation. One rumor reported that Kurtz had decided to return to civilization and was on his way down the river. But after 300 miles, he decided to turn back and return to the inner station in a canoe. It was at this moment, Marlow says, that he seemed to see Kurtz for the first time. It was a distinct glimpse: the dugout, 4 paddling savages, and the lone white man turning his back suddenly on the headquarters, on relief, on thoughts of home. Perhaps setting his face towards the depths of the wilderness, towards his empty and desolate station. When Marlow's journey upriver finally begins, it's almost like he's traveling back in time, to an ancient age when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings. As the boat passes by remote tribal villages, Marlow is shocked by the way the so-called savages act when they're free, unshackled, and unconquered by his civilization. They howled and leaped, and spun, and made horrid faces. But what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours. The thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly. Yes, it was ugly enough. But if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise. A dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you so remote from the night of first ages, could comprehend. And why not? The mind of man is capable of anything, because everything is in it, all the past as well as all the future. What was there after all? Joy, fear, sorrow, devotion, valor, rage? Who can tell? But truth stripped of its cloak of time. Let the fool gape and shudder. The man knows, and he can look on without a wink. But he must at least be as much of a man as these on the shore. He must meet that truth with his own true stuff, with his own inborn strength. Principles won't do. The lofty ideals of European civilization, Marlow discovers, are little more than a veneer to cover up the animal truths of human nature. He's struck by the profound hypocrisy that the white men ordained to civilize the savages are barbarians in their own right, and Marlow is one of them. The closer Marlow gets to Kurtz, he becomes increasingly freed from his cultural conditioning and from the illusions of civilization. As Marlow anxiously counts down the miles to the inner station, his fascination with Kurtz turns into an obsessive desire to meet him. For Marlow, Kurtz comes to represent whatever lies at the heart of this dark mystery. But Marlow's awakening will not come without a cost. Penetrating closer to the heart of darkness brings with it growing fear and danger as Marlow navigates the increasingly treacherous river. As the boat rolls on in the fog, war cries and the beating of drums are heard along the bank. Suddenly, a barrage of arrows comes raining down and mortally wounds one of Marlow's crew, who looks him in the eye as he dies. After the attack subsides, the rest of the crew is scandalized when Marlow throws the victim overboard. He is learning the ways of the wilderness and the ways of Kurtz, pragmatic, cold-blooded, without regard for customs, or silly words like respect, which mean nothing in the jungle. Marlow imagines that by this point, Kurtz is already dead. Little did he know then, the natives were acting to defend Kurtz, to prevent their god from being taken away. Everything in that jungle belonged to Kurtz. The ivory, the river, the people. But the real thing, says Marlow, was to know what he belonged to. How many powers of darkness claimed him for their own. That was the reflection that made you creepy all over. Kurtz, like Marlow, had first come to the jungle with lofty ideas about his mission there. In a report he had written for the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs, Kurtz says that we must necessarily appear to them in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with a might as of a deity. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded. But Kurtz must have gone off the deep end somewhere along the way, because he had gone back later to scribble, "Exterminate all the brutes," over the document. When Marlow finally meets Kurtz, he's on death's doorstep, barely able to speak, mumbling on about the immense plans he had. Marlow doesn't know whether to be attracted or repulsed by this sickly yet charming man. The anticlimax serves to reinforce Marlow's discovery that Kurtz is hollow at the core. And it wasn't Kurtz who Marlow had journeyed to meet, but the heart of darkness itself. I had turned to the wilderness, really, not to Mr. Kurtz, who I was ready to admit was as good as buried. And for a moment it seemed to me as if I also were buried in a vast grave full of unspeakable secrets. I tried to break the spell, the heavy, mute spell of the wilderness that seemed to draw him to its pitiless breast by the awakening of forgotten and brutal instincts, by the memory of gratified and monstrous passions. This alone, I was convinced, had driven him out to the edge of the forest, to the bush, towards the gleam of fires, the throb of drums, the drone of weird incantations. This alone had beguiled his unlawful soul beyond the bounds of permitted aspirations. I had to deal with a being to whom I could not appeal in the name of anything high or low. There was nothing either above or below him, and I knew it. He had kicked himself loose of the earth. Confound the man. He had kicked the very earth to pieces. He was alone, and I before him did not know whether I stood on the ground or floated in the air. I've been telling you what we said, repeating the phrases we pronounced, but what's the good? They were common, everyday words, the familiar, vague sounds exchanged on every waking day of life. But what of that? They had behind them, to my mind, the terrific suggestiveness of words heard in dreams, of phrases spoken in nightmares. Soul. If anybody had ever struggled with a soul, I am the man. But his soul was mad. Being alone in the wilderness, it had looked within itself, and by heavens I tell you, it had gone mad. I had, for my sins I suppose, to go through the ordeal of looking into it myself. No eloquence could have been so withering to one man's belief in mankind as his final burst of sincerity. He struggled with himself too. I saw it. I heard it. I saw the inconceivable mystery of a soul that knew no restraint, no faith, and no fear, yet struggling blindly with itself. Going into the wilderness is a dangerous journey for most, but for Kurtz the danger lies in returning to civilization. After all he had been through, there was no way he could live a normal life following the rules of polite society. As Kurtz is brought back up the river and out of the wilderness, his life force gradually drains away. In the end, who is Kurtz really? A villain? An anti-hero? Some kind of tragic hero? For all his flaws, he possesses an undeniable charisma and gravitas. His courage and willingness to break through boundaries are admirable. He forges his own path, rejecting the rules set for him by his employers and by society at large. At the same time, Kurtz evokes sympathy because in many ways, he's treated unfairly. For the colonialists to be the one to accuse Kurtz of greed is extremely hypocritical, when they themselves are driven by the exact same motive. The real issue with Kurtz is that he says the quiet part out loud, threatening to expose the entire colonial racket for what it truly is. For all his moral failings, Kurtz is at least honest about who he is. But ultimately, Kurtz's final words show the devastating consequences of the path he chose.
Horror. Horror.
The wilderness, both in reality and within his own heart, got the better of him. He succumbed to the darkness. When the smoke clears, Marlow emerges as the hero of the story because of how he matures throughout the journey. Unlike most, he peered into the heart of darkness, setting out on an odyssey to discover the depths of human nature and of his own soul. This is a far cry from where he started, when he believed he was a good person who was on the right side of history. He discovers that whether his original point of view was good or bad, it was at odds with the indifferent laws of nature. Both Kurtz and Marlow discover that they have been lied to by culture and civilization, who told them that nature was somehow evil. Kurtz's solution is to abandon civilization entirely, changing his allegiance from light to dark. Marlow takes a different path. Rather than conquering the darkness like the colonialists, or giving himself away to it like Kurtz, Marlow learns to coexist with the duality of the universe. Carl Jung believed that integrating one's shadow was necessary in order to become an individual. He wondered, how can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole. Jung said that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Some people think they're good because they fight against evil. They're on the good team and the other side is bad. But the line between good and evil is a line drawn straight down the middle of every person's heart.